Time is midnight, April 26, 1986. The rundown program for Unit 4 is well underway, and in less than 90 minutes, the reactor will be destroyed. Reactor power is at approximately 760 megawatts and decreasing. The operating reactivity margin, the equivalent number of control rods in the core, is approximately 24. There are a number of people on the shift tonight, including Shift Supervisor Alexander Akimov, Senior Reactor Control Engineer Leonid Toptonov, Senior Block Control Engineer Boris Stolyachuk, Senior Turbine Control Engineer Igor Kirschenbaum, as well as Dyatlov, the Deputy Chief Engineer, a number of representatives from Dontech Energo, a number of people who want to spectate the rundown, and a few others who are generally involved in the reactor maintenance. Akimov and Yuri Tregub, the shift supervisor on the previous test, are currently going through the turbine rundown program itself, and discussing what needs to be done in order to make sure that the rundown itself goes ahead smoothly. Dyatlov is also present, eager to get the rundown over and done with, due to the delays from the Kiev delay, as well as the turbine measurements that are undergoing in the turbine hall. Reactor power continues to decline, down towards 700 megawatts, and then they will make the decision to go below. The cause of this has been hotly disputed. However, in general, this is placed on the idea that running the turbine rundown program at high power would result in the accumulation of steam and pressure in the steam separators, which is obviously not good. Razim Davletbayev, the deputy head of the turbine workshop for operation, arrives at the control room. He begins writing shift assignments for the staff of the turbine shop, for the withdrawal of equipment that will be repaired once Unit 4 is shut down. Waiting for the power drop to proceed, the Atlov leaves the control room to inspect areas of Unit 4 that needed to undergo maintenance following the shutdown. Leonid Toptonov is being observed by many people, including Proskulyakov and Kudryavstev, 2 trainee senior reactor control engineers who will take up positions at Unit 5 at the end of the year. At the Unit 3 main circulation pump halls, there is an arrival. These are Alexander Yevchenko and Valery Perevoschenko, who arrive at room 523-1 to drink tea with Agilov and the other workers there. Perevoschenko tells Agilov that Unit 4 was supposed to be shut down that night, but a test was to be carried out beforehand. This didn't concern Agilov, as it was the job of Valery Hodomchuk and others to carry out the necessary procedures for that test. The city of Pripyat remains quiet. Aside from the occasional ambulance, police car, and a few vehicles driving around the city, nothing out of the ordinary is happening here. Meanwhile, the building site for Units 5 and 6 is in full operation, as builders work round the clock to construct Units 5 and 6 and ensure that Unit 5 is ready to start up by the end of the year. Reactor power continues to decline. At the Phase 1 central control room, between Units 1 and 2, is Boris Rogozhkin. Rogozhkin is the Chief Shift Supervisor for Chernobyl Units 3 and 4. However, for some reason he is not in Central Control Room 2. From here, Rogozhkin is communicating with both Akimov and the Turbine Hall, to ensure that the turbine rundown program goes smoothly. He is also watching from that control room to observe the turbine behaviour. In the control room of Unit 3, led by Shift Supervisor Yuri Bagdasarov, everything is normal. Now might be an appropriate time to discuss what actually is the Turbine Rundown Program. The idea of it stems from a question. What would happen to the reactor in the event of a power loss in conjunction with a maximum design basis accident? Which would be, for example, the complete destruction of a 600mm coolant pipe that pumps water towards the reactor core. In this case, it would be necessary to generate an additional source of electricity while the diesel generators are running up. Or perhaps you don't have to generate this at all. Perhaps the inertia of the turbines that are running down as the reactor scrams would be enough to bridge this gap. Previous attempts at the Turbine Rundown program had been failures, namely due to the inability to actually record results. Simultaneously, vibration measurements are being undertaken on turbine number 8, which will require the reactor to be disconnected and run down separately before the experiment can begin. For this purpose, inside the turbine hall is a red Mercedes that was purchased by the Soviet Union and used to measure the vibrations of turbines. This vehicle had only been purchased at the end of last year. Dyatlov continues to examine areas that will need maintenance. It is generally safer to go at lower powers, where both radiation and temperatures are much lower. Tregub is busy watching the SIUT panel when suddenly an alarm goes off at the reactor panel. He rushes over to see what is going on, beating Akimov, who is actually closer. The alarm indicates there has been a decrease in water consumption, so Tregub goes over to observe what is happening and potentially to correct the situation. Unfortunately for Toptonov, during the transition from local automatic control to global automatic control, a fault has occurred. When Leonid Toptonov switched off the local automatic regulator number 1 came into automatic regime. Detecting the negative imbalance in the reactor core, power dropping, it moves to the upper limit stop switch, i.e. it fully withdraws. Automatic Regulator 2 cannot enter automatic mode because of the strong imbalance in the ionization chambers. During this period where the automatic regulators cannot move, for some as yet unknown reason, reactor power plummets. Whatever the cause of this, it was likely exacerbated by the positive power coefficient, which works both ways. Where reactor power increases, a further increase in power will occur, and where there's a decrease in power, a further decrease will occur. This could result in the sudden loss of boiling throughout the reactor core, which Toptonov cannot actually control from his panel. Reactor power eventually plummets all the way down to 30 megawatts of thermal power. At this point, Toptonov, Akimov and Tregub pause and decide what to do. Although for Tregub, this wasn't really much of a difficult decision. They were going to raise that power. And so, they began to pull out control rods. In the central control room, Rogozhkin continues to set up preparations for the disconnection of the turbine and the turbine rundown program. Under the supervision of Yuri Tregub, Toptonov continues to withdraw control rods. Not only is he being monitored by the trainee senior reactor control engineers, but also Alexander Akimov. At the turbine pult, Davletbayev sees Kirshenbaum put the turbine in a mode close to idle, producing just 3 to 5 megawatts. He walks over and tells him that, if there is a decrease in the pressure of the separator drum, unload the turbine, but don't disengage the motor of the generator, and if there is a further decrease despite this, turn it off. Tregub and Toptonov switch positions so that Tregub is now in front of the reactor pult. Tregub leads the way in withdrawing the control rods. Tregub also notes that Toptonov is pulling more so from the third and fourth quadrants, and asks him why he is pulling the rods unevenly. This leads Tregub to begin to help Toptonov by guiding him on which control rods were the best to pull out. The signal for emergency fluctuations of water level in the steam separator drums is switched on. Dyatlov returns to the control room of Unit 4. He sees Toptonov, Akimov, Proskyryakov and Kudryavtsev gathered around the reactor control panel. Thermal output of the reactor is about 70 megawatts and increasing. Akimov reports that when switching from local automatic control to global, the power had dropped to 30 megawatts, and they were trying to raise it. This did not concern Dyatlov, who allowed them to continue raising the power. To prevent an automatic shutdown of the reactor, the emergency protection system trip point, in response to a drop in steam separator pressure, is changed from 55 kilograms per centimeter squared to 50 kilograms per centimeter squared. Davletbayev tells Dyatlov that if the steam to turbine number 8 decreases any further, they will have to shut off the turbine. Dyatlov nods to Tregub, Akimov, Toptonov, Kudryavtsev and Proskyryakov, who are all gathered around the reactor pult, raising the power and tells Davletbayev that the power will be restored. At this time, Yevchenko, Agilov and Perevozchenko ascend to plus 58.5 in the reactor hull of Unit 4 to retrieve the paint that they need to paint the main circulation pumps that night. However, they lack the paintbrushes necessary to carry out their work, and so they descend back down and head to room 412, Yevchenko's storeroom, to see if he has any spare paintbrushes. They are the last people to see the reactor of Unit 4 intact. Dyatlov is speaking to Metlenko, discussing the turbine rundown program when Akimov approaches them. He asks Dyatlov for permission to raise the power to 200 megawatts instead of 700 megawatts. Dyatlov approves this, as it will have no impact on the test. Dreg, the system that monitors the reactor parameters, is switched off due to preparation of the magnetic tape for the Dreg system by the SDIVT for the rundown test. Turbo generator number 8 is disconnected from the reactor to determine the vibration characteristics during a rundown. This is recorded by the operators in the Mercedes. Reactor power is approaching 160 megawatts. The operating reactivity margin is equal to 19.7 manual control rods inserted in the core. Soon they will be able to turn on the automatic regulators once again, which will allow them to better control the power. The automatic regulators begin functioning again, with a number of overcompensation upward signals being switched on. Reactor power is beginning to climb towards 200 megawatts, where they can stabilize it. The dreg system regains function, although there are immediate emergency fluctuation of water level in the steam separator drum signals. Also, around this time, the personnel block the EPS signal intended to shut down turbo generators 7 and 8. This means that whenever a turbine is disconnected, the reactor will not emergency scram. Overcompensation of the automatic regulators and emergency fluctuation of water level in the steam separator drum signals continue to switch on and off. The time is 1 AM. The reactor power has been quasi-stabilised at 200 megawatts. The operating reactivity margin is equal to 17.2 manual control rods inserted into the core. There are still automatic regulator fluctuations and emergency fluctuations of water levels in the steam separator drums. In particular, the water in the steam separator drums are at 505mm below the centre mark on the left and 168mm below the centre mark on the right. They need to be close to the centre mark, especially with the fact that they are going to be turning on all 8 main circulation pumps, which will take up more water. Therefore, Boris Stolyachuk needs to increase the feed water flow rate. Dyatlov asks Toptonov about the current operating reactivity margin. Toptonov responds that it is roughly equivalent to 19 or 18 manual control rods inserted into the core. Stolyachuk begins gradually increasing the feed water flow rate on the left side. Within 20 seconds, it has been increased from 124 tonnes per hour to 424 tonnes per hour. The water level in the steam separator drums begins to increase. Main circulation pump number 12, the 7th main circulating pump, is activated. Dyatlov calls room 412 and asks for Perevoschenko to go to the control room to observe the rundown experiment. Stolyachuk now greatly increases the feed water flow rate. It peaks at 1,392 tons on the left side per hour and 1,152 tons per hour on the right side. Main circulation pump number 22, the 8th main circulating pump, is also activated. Despite the feed water flow rate increases, the amount of water in the steam separator drums is now decreasing again. Stolyachuk will soon have to increase the amount of water flowing into the steam separator drums to compensate. Akimov, clutching the test program in hand, walks from desk to desk, asking Stolyachuk and Toptonov about the status of their equipment, and assisting Stolyachuk in managing the water levels in the steam separator drums. Yet again, the dreg system is knocked out. To fix parameters for the rundown program. Valery Perevoschenko arrives at the control room to observe the rundown program. Turbine number 8 is reconnected to the system, and begins to run up in preparation for the rundown. Dreg is again reconnected and started up, and almost immediately reports emergency fluctuations in the water level in the steam separator drums. Stolyarchuk will urgently have to correct this. And so he begins a dramatic feed water flow rate increase in both sides of the reactor. This will result in the withdrawal of manual control rods in order to compensate. At this time, Oleg Gemrik and Anatoly Kurgos are in the break room on floor plus 35.5, the same as the reactor hull. The room they are in is used as a smoking room, near the reactor hull, when Kurgos asks Gemrik if he could copy his note on refueling machine operation for an upcoming exam. Gemrik retires to another room adjacent to the break room to try and nap while Kurgos copies his notes. Gemrik takes off his jacket containing his pass. Meanwhile, Akimov is going from person to person, instructing them on their roles in the turbine rundown program. At this time, a phone call is made to the North Main Circulation Pump Hall of Unit 4. There is an issue with Pump 22, which Hydroproject decides to repair. He approaches Pump 22, right in the middle of the North Main Circulation Pump Hall. At this time, parameters recorded on the magnetic tape indicate that operating reactivity margin is equal to 7.5 control rods. However, as the feed water flow rate decreases, the control rods again begin to insert themselves, bringing the operating reactivity margin closer to a value of 15, the permissible limit. Metlenko sits at a desk near where Akimov was working, and picks up the phone. Oscilloscope engage. The emergency stop valves of turbogenerator 8 are closed. Rundown of main circulation pumps 13, 14, 23 and 24 begins. After some delay, the diesel generators begin running up. The reactor should have scrammed at the start of the experiment. However, because they disabled the trip protection on the turbine, the reactor is still running. Toptonov notices this and asks Akimov what to do, who makes a tapping motion with his finger. Toptonov presses AZ5.
Оперативную машину на выезд.
Что там такое?
Танечка, иди сюда быстрее, нас атомная горит. Ой, мать.
Dyatlov sends Proskuryakov and Kudryavstev to go to the reactor hall to lower the control rods manually. Realizing this is impossible, he chases them out into the corridor, but cannot stop them. Brajnik runs into the control room and announces that the turbine hall is on fire. He runs back out, and many others follow him. Unit 3 has to undergo an emergency power reduction as the explosion has degraded the vacuums around their turbines. Out on the cooling pond, Vladimir Starovatov, who witnessed the explosion, suddenly watches as black rain falls from above on top of him. This rain is heavily contaminated with remains of reactor number 4. This will cause him to receive a very severe radiation dose.
На главном корпусе, третий, четвертый, между третьим и четвертым.
А там люди есть?
Да.
И люди есть, да?
Да.
И в результате взрыва что там горит?
Отметка 12. На отметке плюс 12, 7-я машина.
Сколько машин вы направили?
Все машины выехали.
Поднимай над состав.
Поднимаю, начальника поднял.
Так всех, весь офицерский состав, офицерский корпус поднимай.
The power reduction of Unit 3 continues. Degtyarenko, who was close to the north main circulation pump hall at the time of the explosion, has ran all the way to control room number 3. Yuri Bagdasarov, the shift supervisor, urgently calls Yevchenko's storeroom for a stretcher. Yevchenko obliges and runs all the way to the control room of Unit 3. Outside of the control room, Yevchenko encounters Degtyarenko, who he cannot recognize due to how heavily burned he is. Degtyarenko tells Yevchenko that Gennady Rosanovsky was close to the north main circulation pump hole as well, and needs to be rescued. Yevchenko sets off to rescue him. Alexander Agilov, who was with Yevchenko at the time, arrives at room 523 and finds his operators Moskalenko and Evdokchenko. Agilov immediately tells them to put on petal respirators and not go anywhere without an instruction to do so. When they ask what happened, Agilov cannot answer. Proskuryakov and Kudryavstev returned to the control room. The reactor hall was inaccessible by the route they took, as debris blocked off the stairs. Meanwhile, Oleg Gemrik and Anatoly Kurgos are descending down the clean staircase to safety. The emergency lighting here is still working, and Gemrik observes that Kurgos has sustained severe injuries, with the skin hanging from his fingertips. They quickly descend the vent block. The first fire engines from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant fire station arrive. Initially, they stop outside of the second main administration building. Kravik, upon seeing the scale of the disaster, radios alarm signal number 3, summoning firefighters from all across the Kiev region. He tells Ivan Shavry, another firefighter, that they're really going to have to work there. Dyatlov exits the control room with the intention of looking at the reactor hull from outside. On the way out, he encounters Gemrik and Kurgos, who have met with the gas circuit operators Simonenko and Semikopov. He orders them to get Kurgos to a medical unit immediately, and Simonenko tells him that the entire reactor building is destroyed. Dyatlov walks down the corridor and looks out to see the reactor building completely destroyed. In disbelief, he continues down to the end of the corridor, down a flight of stairs, and towards the main transport corridor leading out of the building. This corridor is severely flooded, and will cause Dyatlov to receive a significant radiation dose. The fire engines of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant fire brigade drive to the back of the turbine hall to fight the fires there. Firefighters climb to the roof with fireproof canvases, attempting to smother out the blaze by stepping on it. The Pripyat Fire Brigade also arrives at the scene. They join efforts to localise the fire at the turbine hall initially. However, they are instead sent to the northern face, where the destroyed remains of Unit 3 and 4.
Час 35 минут. Леонид Алексеевич.
Да.
Алло, Припять, 3 и 4 блок горит крыша в результате аварии взрыва.
Ой, давай. Так уже подтвердили?
Не подтвердили, авария там произошла у них. Фотодиспетчер Припяти сказала, ВПЧ-2. Я, значит, высылаю, потом кого? Полецкая, пусть и едут.
Всех, поднимай Татьяна.
Outside of the control room of Unit 3, Bagdasarov sees Proskuryov and Kudryavtsev. They are preparing to go to the reactor hall of Unit 4, alongside Valery Perevoschenko. Bagdasarov yells at them to leave, but they choose not to. The flames on the roof of the turbine hall are incredibly hot. Petrovsky and Shavri, the two firefighters leading the firefighting efforts on the roof, begin to remove their protective gear, including their helmets. The rooms directly underneath the engines of the main circulation pumps of Reactor 3 are already beginning to flood.
Да. Ага, сейчас все. Высылайте. Да, едет.
Another significant explosion is recorded by the operators in the control room of Unit 4. This is associated with a pressure increase in the airtight compartments around the south steam separators, indicating that an explosion of potentially hydrogen took place here. The first ambulance arrives at the scene. Shcherbak, the paramedic who was inside that ambulance, calls Pripyat Hospital number 126 and tells them that there is a fire. There are people with burns and a doctor was needed urgently. Valentin Belikon leaves for the power plant, while the hospital's dispatcher calls the head of the medical unit. 2 more ambulances join Belikon's to the power plant. Yevchenko and Tregub encounter Parovoschenko, Proskyukov and Kudryavstev, who are going to the plus 35.5 entrance to the reactor hall on the east side, to lower the control rods. Despite Yevchenko's protests, stating the reactor is destroyed, having seen it from outside, Parovoschenko responds that they still have to try. As Yevchenko is the only one with a flashlight, he joins Parovoschenko, Proskyukov and Kudryavstev, while Tregub returns to the control room to report the damage. At the ambulance outside the second main administration building, Degtyarenko has already boarded. Kurgaz also enters the ambulance, but when Gemrich goes to follow, he is blocked, as he left his pass inside the building. Gemrich tells them to write his name down, but the guard does not let him leave, and forces him out of the ambulance at gunpoint. Kurgaz leaves the site.
Алло, Полесская? Да. Вы, значит, выезжаете на атомную станцию, там горит крыша третьего, четвертого блока.
The iodine pills inside of control room number 3 have run out. Bagdasarov opts to use diluted iodine tincture. As there was no drinking water, they decide to take the water to the control room in cisterns, and they start giving this drink to people who entered the control room. As part of damage mitigation, Agilov closes the compressed air valve to Unit 4, and then sees an opening towards Unit 4's north main circulation pump hole. He sees a pile of cement and pipes, and then Rosanovsky, still in shock, having hardly moved from where he was during the explosion, his hands outstretched and shaking. He was repeating, "Valery Hodemchuk is back there." Agilov tries to explain that they cannot access the hall. Yovchenko, Perevoschenko, Proskuryakov and Kudryavtsev reach plus 35.5. Yovchenko holds the door open, while the other 3 enter the reactor hall and observe the damage. Belikon now arrives at the power plant. A security guard questions why he is not wearing any protection, but Belikon isn't sure why he would need it.
Алло, Василий Васильевич. Алло.
Да.
Это диспетчер вопрос. Значит, Василий Васильевич, нас на атомной электростанции произошел взрыв ГИП 33-4 блока.
Если подумал, тут машину здесь высадите, нет?
Да, оперативно выезжает, персонально заезжает.
Давайте личный состав, давайте город поднимайте, так что сразу 6 десяток, перезвоните сразу за мной.
Хорошо, понял.
Вот, поднимайте личный состав.
Хорошо.
Boris Prushinsky, the chief engineer of Soyuz Atomenergo, is woken by a call about the accident at his home in Moscow. He begins to make his way to the Soyuz Atomenergo headquarters, where they will respond to the accident from Moscow. A young surgeon, Anatoly Ben, arrives at hospital number 126. He arrives at his department on the second floor of the building, changes into his overalls, and then peers out of the window at the fourth reactor, observing the fire and the smoke. He calls his wife, Tatiana, who was also a doctor at hospital number 126, and asked her to prepare for an evacuation. Arriving behind the ambulances is a shuttle bus carrying a number of workers to the nuclear power plant. Among them is Viktor Brakhanov, the director of the nuclear power plant. When he sees the collapsed remains of the building, there's only one thought in his mind. He's going to prison. Dyatlov arrives at the Unit 3 control room. He asks Bagdasarov if the accident was impacting his work. Bagdasarov tells him it was not, and they had inspected their part of the reactor block. Dyatlov is given a prophylactic iodine prep. He takes it and leaves. The first of the patients have arrived at Pripyat. This includes Anatoly Kurguz and Viktor Degtyarenko. Ben tends to Kurguz, helping to cut off his clothing to assess the severity of his injuries. Still in a state of shock, Kurguz sang songs from his time in the Navy, occasionally pausing to attempt to recount his actions. Ben is only able to bandage Kurguz's worst wounds. Viktor Brakhanov arrives at his office. He calls the telephone operator to request that they summon the entire senior management to the power plant. He then tries to contact the Unit 4 control room, but receives no response. Therefore, Brakhanov himself departs for the Unit 4 control room. In Moscow, the head of Moscow Hospital No. 6's inpatient department, Dr. Angelina Guskova, is woken by a duty officer to attend the Ministry of Health. A car is sent to the hospital, where she lives, to bring her there. Perevozchenko, Yevchenko, Kudryavtsev and Proskyakov were sent to open the emergency core coolant system valves on plus 27. Perevozchenko enters the room, and as he opens the valves, a large steam release occurs and floods the room. As it does not subside, they conclude it is all they can do, and they descend back down to the Unit 4 control room to report their failure. On the roof, Kravik is joined by members of the Pripyat Fire Brigade as they attempt to extinguish the flames up there, preventing the fire from spreading to Unit 3. They will accumulate a lethal dose. In Moscow, Boris Prushinsky calls Georgy Kopchinsky, director of the Soviet Central Committee on Nuclear Energy. Prushinsky informs Kopchinsky that an explosion has occurred, and Unit 4 is burning. Kopchinsky asks if the emergency assistance plan has been brought into action, and Prushinsky confirms it has. Agilov returns to room 213-1 in the main circulation pump hole, and he can start to smell graphite, which he was familiar with, having been present for the construction of Reactor 3. This creates a sense of nervousness in him. Having confirmed checks on the pumps had been completed, Agilov decides to inspect Control Room 4. Oleg Gemrich is outside of the second main administration building, when he suddenly vomits and is escorted by Simonenko to Belikov. Belikov, on the phone, sees the man complaining of symptoms matching the onset of acute radiation syndrome and orders him into one of the 3 ambulances now there. Brakhanov arrives at the Unit 4 control room. He asks Dyatlov and Akimov to report on the nature of the accident. Neither can specify a cause, but Akimov assures Brakhanov that the reactor is intact. The firefighters on the roof have a hard time extinguishing even the smallest fires on the roof. Presumably this was caused by superheated core elements vaporizing the water before it could be extinguished. The explosion fractured fire hydrants, rendering them useless. A fire hose is being laid, as a result, on the roof of the vent block. Georgy Kopchinsky calls Vladimir Marin, his supervisor and head of the nuclear power sector of the Heavy Industry and Energy Division of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee. Akimov tells Paravoschenko that Hodemchuk and 2 reactor hall employees are missing, and to go search for them. He does not know that these 2 reactor hall operators, Gemrich and Kurguz, have already left the site. Meanwhile, Palamachuk brings a heavily wounded Shashanok to the Unit 4 control room. Shashanok was unconscious and not reacting to the immense pain he would have been in. Shashanok was close to the site of the explosion and had his ribs crushed when a concrete pillar fell on him. He was found with his hands and head dangling out of the building. Dyatlov orders for Palamachuk and Yurchenko to escort Shashanok to Unit 3, where he will be safe. Meanwhile, 3 employees of the Kharkiv turbine plant, led by Kabanov, approach Dyatlov. Dyatlov tells them to leave. When Kabanov tells Dyatlov he wants to go back to retrieve the Mercedes from the turbine hall, Dyatlov raises his voice for the only time of the night, telling them, "Damn it, to hell with that machine, get out of the unit now!" Yuri Bagdasarov is informed that the clean condensate tanks are empty, which is a significant safety risk. As a result of this information, Bagdasarov now contacts Rogozhkin, asking to shut down Unit 3. Meanwhile, Yurchenko and Palamachuk arrive outside with Shashanok. The senior reactor control engineer gives Yurchenko his jacket to replace Yurchenko's torn one. Yurchenko informs Bagdasarov that the pump hole of Reactor 4 has been destroyed, and that Hodemchuk was missing. Bagdasarov assumes that the cause of the explosion was a pump rupture. Brakhanov returns to his office in the main administration building. He then calls the chief dosimetrist and asks for the radiation situation. He is told that the only devices they have measured up to 3.6 rontgens per hour, and in most areas of the power plant, the dosimeters have completely maxed out. Brakhanov then calls Gennady Veretennikov, head of the All-Union Industrial Department for Nuclear Energy. Grigori Revenkov, the first-party secretary of the Kiev region, and Vitaly Sklerov, Ukrainian Minister of Power and Electrification, informing them that an accident is unfolding. Bagdasarov contacts Kotov, shift supervisor at Unit 1, and demands an immediate organisation of hand barrows to facilitate the transport of injured workers, and to call all the ambulances. Then he receives a phone call. Rogozhkin tells Bagdasarov that he could not get permission from the grid dispatcher, and therefore he could not shut down Unit 3. Agilov and Yevchenko meet up in the south main circulation pump hall and begin to look for Hydroproject. Bagdasarov still does not know what to do with the reactor. As every second passes, the risk of a significant accident there grows larger and larger and larger. Brekhanov calls Vladimir Voloshko, chairman of the Pripyat Party Committee, to request that they prepare for an evacuation. Voloshko doubts Brekhanov's instincts, which makes Brekhanov doubt his own authority, and the call ends. Parashin and Vorobyov, two people responding to the disaster, reach Brekhanov's office and find Brekhanov and the second secretary of the Pripyat Committee, Veselovsky, already there. Brekhanov suggested they move to the bunker. Agilov and Yevchenko make their way through Block V of the South MCP Hall and peer into the Unit 4 side. Through the opening, they can only see steam being blown upwards from underneath. "24-year-old Sergeant Alexander Petrovsky, Ivan Shavry, and another firefighter are ascending the building to the vent block when, at level plus 30, they pass Pravik and the other firefighters who are descending from the roof, suffering from the early symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. Petrovsky orders the firefighter to help Pravik and the group down while he and Shavry continue to the roof, alone. Akimov sends Toptonov and Kirshenbaum to the Unit 3 control room, while he and Stolyachuk remain. Lelachenko, the electrician, guides Akimov on what loads to shut down and circuits to shut off in order to de-energize the maximum number of cables and circuits around the block. Bagdasarov decides to ignore Rogozhkin's order, as well as the grid dispatcher, and begins the procedure to shut down Unit 3 with emergency speed. This procedure begins with the use of AZ-3, which reduces the operating power of the reactor from 100% to 50% at 2% per second. Outside, Leonid Telyatnikov, the firefighter who had taken command of the situation, encounters Pravik alongside the other men who had joined him on the roof. They report the situation. Telyatnikov orders Pravik and his men to Belikon's ambulance, having spent 30 minutes on the roof. At this time, all fires on levels 4.3, 12.5, 27 and 31.5 have been extinguished, totaling an area of roughly 250 square meters of fire. The men are put in an ambulance, and they depart towards Pripyat Hospital number 126. At the hospital, Shcherbak has arrived. As Anatoly Ben is cutting off Shcherbak's clothing, his injuries become apparent. His rib cage has been caved in, and his back is twisted to the point that it was broken. Despite this, Shcherbak is conscious and talking, trying to explain that Hydroproject was still in the North Pump Hall. He looks at his wife, a nurse at hospital number 126, but is quickly taken to the intensive care unit. Having crossed along room 408, Agilov and Yevchenko reach room 402-2, a potential place Hydroproject may have been. They can only see a pile of debris that makes their route inaccessible to the North MCP Hall. They call out for Hydroproject, but there is no response. More and more injured and sick firefighters arrive at Belikon's stand outside of the second administration building. Belikon administers Relanium, chlorpromazine, and other drugs, purely to relieve their pain. Belikon asks for potassium iodide from hospital number 126 to be delivered. However, the hospital refuses to deliver it until they have seen the patients. Agilov and Yevchenko climb a ladder used to service the MCPs, and they look into room 402-2. Again they call for Hydroproject, but their shouts are drowned out by noises around them. more fire engines arrive, including the fire service from Polisk. Only 3 firefighters are member of this group, but they join localised efforts to fight the fire on the roof of the turbine hall. Another fire engine is drove directly in front of the collapsed remains of the building. A firefighting headquarters is established. Captain of the Internal Service Leonenko is selected as Chief of Staff. Senior Lieutenant of the Internal Service, Berezin, is appointed as Head of Logistics. Lieutenant of the Internal Service, Datsko, is responsible for coordinating the efforts of the firefighters with the civil defence in the ABK-1 bunker, and medical personnel arriving on site. Senior Lieutenant of the Internal Service, Sazonov, is tasked with establishing contact with the administrative workers of the power plant to gauge the status of the 3 other reactors. A small number of turbine operators arrive at Turbine 7, offering help. Davletbayev declines it and sends them back to safety. Kopczynski arrives at Soyuz Atomenergo, which was assembling an emergency headquarters to deal with the accident. He finds out Veretennikov, ahead of the Union, had already arrived. Petrov, an equipment manager at Yuzhatom Energomontaj, is arriving at Pripyat from the north. As he passes Yanov station, he can see the flames lighting up VT2. Instead of continuing home, he chooses to drive up towards the power plant to get a better look at the unfolding disaster. Agilov and Yuvchenko make their way to a 50cm diameter opening in the wall, intended for passing a cable through, which looks into room 435. They peer inside and call out for Hodemchuk, but there is no response. Vorobyov decides to take a dosimeter and walks around outside of the main administration building. He encounters readings of 150 milliroentgens per hour outside of the building, an incredibly high number. He runs back inside to warn Brekhanov. However, Brekhanov decides to wait for more information from senior dosimetrists when they arrive. As Dyatlov is walking to the Unit 3 control room, he passes Anatoly Sitnikov and Vladimir Chuganov. They are in full protection and tell Dyatlov that they have been sent by Brekhanov to inspect the damage. Dyatlov tells them there is nothing to look at, puts on a respirator, and continues to Unit 3. Agilov and Yuvchenko make their way to room 406, where there is a stairwell descending to +9. When they make their way down, they find a calm spot, with no dust or sound. They make their way to the doors to room 305-2, the sub-reactor space. Davletbayev examines turbines 7 and 8. Not knowing that the radiation levels were significant, he concludes that the smell of ozone is most likely due to the short-circuiting caused by burning cables. Agilov and Yuvchenko reach the entrance to the sub-reactor space, but cannot enter. This spares them from the hellscape that is within. Dyatlov again arrives at the Unit 3 control room. Rogozhin, the station shift manager, was present and suggests that Dyatlov coordinate the operation with Brekhanov. Dyatlov ignores him and orders Unit 3 to be shut down while the situation was still normal. On Dyatlov's way back to the Unit 4 control room, he passes the Chief Deputy of the Safety Engineering Department, Krasnozhin, who was wearing clothes sized too large and his head wrapped by a towel, so that only his eyes were visible. While they didn't discuss the level of the radiation, Krasnozhin laughed at his own appearance. Dyatlov laughed at himself about it in his head, and throws up severely while doing so. Agilov and Yevchenko partially descend down a stairwell to level 6. With their flashlights weakening, they can only see a short distance. A silent room with no dust nor the sounds of the pumps, which should have been audible. They do not continue down any further, concerned their flashlights would burn out and they would become lost in the darkness. The corridor they are in would be the location of the elephant's foot.
Пожарохраны подполковник Купер. Слушаю. Нам надо добраться до начальника смены станции. Ну вот он я. Это вы, да? Да. Какая обстановка у вас там? Попросите что-нибудь полегче. Причина разрушения. Это купол первый. Это главный корпус. Да, главный корпус. 4-й блок. Корпус, это крыша горит. В помещение попасть нельзя. Крыша горит. Крыша горела. Горела или горит? Ну, я не вижу отсюда, мне не видно. Не в курсе, да? Да. Так, мы направили... Пожарники мне сказали, что вызвали из Киева. Мы направили вам 40 подразделений пожарной охраны. Сделайте там пропускную систему, что-то попроще. А я сказал, охранник. В общем, мы направили нам всю зону. Примерно 30-40 подразделений. Объявили сбор в личный состав. Что вы хотите делать? Вы постараетесь включить ваши системы, там, крышу, чтобы там было 2 системы. Все разрушилось, уже и крыши-то половина нету. Разрушилось? Конечно. Вы на связи с атомной вышли? А? На связи с атомной вышли? Как же? Выше, да? Конечно. Хорошо, вот и мы поднимаем все область туда. Ну давай. Давай, все.
Petrov drives past the construction office and parks up roughly 100 meters from the 4th unit. Using only the light from the fires that were burning across the building, he was able to spot the destroyed steam drums glowing red, and understands that the central hall had been destroyed. He looks down to see the debris where the north pump hole once had been, with the pumps emerging above, and could see firefighters and their trucks, as well as an ambulance driving away from the scene. Looking up, he can see someone standing on plus 70, the roof of the vent block, which causes him to become uncomfortable with the situation. Looking at the flames and smelling ozone, Petrov turns around and starts driving back to his home in Pripyat. Meanwhile, the fire over the turbine hull roof is successfully extinguished, preventing the complete collapse. Specialists, including members of the Emergency Assistance Group, begin to arrive at Soyuz Atomenergo. A sense of worry over the cause of the accident, the scale, the radiation situation, and the presence of emergency core cooling is starting to rise. Having assessed the condition of the lower floors of Unit 4, Agilov and Yevchenko have made their way to the Unit 3 transport corridor. They leave through the large doors to approach Unit 4 on the ground level. At the north pump hole, the low-range dosimeter is measuring off the chart. The dosimetrist is dismissed as Perevoschenko climbs into the north pump hole as he searches for Hodemchuk. Perevoschenko would receive a lethal dose doing this. Despite several attempts, no contact can be established between Soyuz Atmenergo and the Chernobyl MPP. Agilov and Yevchenko look at Unit 4 from the outside. They note that the walls to the main circulation pump hole are entirely gone, and only the tops of the motors are visible. As Agilov looks upwards, he glanced at the central hull, with the outer wall sagging downwards in a curved shape. A thought crosses Agilov's mind. Can everything really be destroyed? The two men make their way back inside and part ways. Vorobyov, desperate to prove the high levels of radiation, begins a drive around the exterior of the power plant, with his DP5 radiometer going off the scale. He will return to the bunker and tell Brekhanov that it is necessary to warn the population of Pripyat. However, Brekhanov still stalls. Petrov returns to his apartment in Pripyat, and his family wake up upon his arrival. They told him that they heard explosions in the night, but didn't know what happened, and so Petrov chooses to fill them in. The Chief of Radiation Safety, Korobeinikov, reports to Brekhanov that the highest detected radiation level was 13 millirongens per hour. Vorobyov believes every word of this is a lie, as it would be impossible to reach the power plant without passing through the area of elevated radiation. So he opts to leave the bunker to measure the radiation level for a third time. Finally, Chernobyl Unit 3 is shut down. Armin Abagayan, director of the All-Union Research Institute for Nuclear Power Plant Operation, is woken by a call from the Ministry of Energy and Electrification concerning the accident. He confirms it is not a civil defence exercise, and then packs his bag and drives to the ministry. Dyatlov and Perevozchenko return to the control room from the North Pump Hall, with Perevozchenko throwing up. Dyatlov tells Akimov to call for Babichev, a substitute for Akimov, and for the Unit 4 ventilation to be shut off, with the Unit 3 ventilation turned on to prevent air from Unit 4 contaminating Unit 3. The men in Moscow continue to anxiously wait for information to arrive from Chernobyl. Phone calls go through, but they are never answered. Eventually, someone does pick up. Mikhail Lyutov, Deputy Chief Engineer for Science, contacts Soyuz Atmanergo from Chernobyl. With extreme restraint, he explains an accident had occurred during tests on Unit 4. When Lyutov is asked about emergency cooling, he responds angrily, and there is nothing left to be cooled. As soon as he says this, the connection is interrupted.